Let me take you back. Just imagine, a young boy from Benoni, 17 years old, steps up to a podium, heart pounding, palms sweaty, mind racing, and then he wins. Not only does he win, but he realizes in that moment the world just changed. And from that moment, I changed. Let me take you back to a time when life was simple but heavy. The streets I grew up in weren't paved with opportunity. They were littered with reminders of what I couldn't become. The conversations around me were about survival, never about strategy. The air was thick with limitation. And yet, in the middle of all of that noise, there was this whisper deep inside that said, "You were built for something bigger." I remember being young, still trying to figure myself out, but already sensing that the world wanted to put me in a box. People around me spoke in small sentences, with small visions, with small dreams. It wasn't because they lacked ambition, but because they had been taught that reaching for more was dangerous. They had been convinced that success belonged to someone else, someone born into it. And yet I carried this strange defiance. I couldn't accept that my story would be written for me before I had even learned how to hold the pen. So when the opportunity came to stand in front of an audience and speak, it wasn't just about words. It was about finally having a chance to break free. I didn't step onto that stage to win. I stepped on that stage to prove, first to myself, that I could stand tall in a world that wanted me to bow. And when I spoke, something happened. My words connected. My voice found a rhythm. The audience leaned in, and for the first time, I felt what it was like to hold attention, to command respect, to move people not with money or power, but with truth. That competition changed everything. I was just a teenager, skinny, nervous, unsure. But in that moment, I discovered that confidence is not the absence of fear. Confidence is the decision to act while your knees are shaking. And when the judges called my name as the winner, I realized that the world had just opened a new door for me. It wasn't the trophy that mattered. It was the shift inside me. Winning showed me something far greater, that I had the ability to create outcomes different from what the world expected of me. That was the first time I understood power. Not the power of wealth or influence, but the power of voice, the power of conviction, the power of daring to step into spaces you've been told don't belong to you. The victory didn't just hand me a medal, it handed me perspective. Suddenly, possibilities I had never imagined became real. It wasn't just a win in a competition. It was proof that I could rewrite the script. And that proof was intoxicating. Now, don't misunderstand me. Winning that moment didn't mean life suddenly became easy. It didn't erase the poverty, the struggles at home, the long shadows of doubt. What it did was ignite something. It lit a fire that said, if you can do this once, you can do it again. That fire became an anchor for me. Every time I stumbled, every time I failed, every time the world reminded me of where I came from, I went back to that stage in my mind. I remembered the feeling of standing tall, the sound of applause, the taste of victory against all odds. That's the thing about beginnings. They are never perfect. They are messy, painful, uncertain. But sometimes in the middle of that chaos, you find your first glimpse of who you are meant to become. And that glimpse, once you've seen it, refuses to let you go. It keeps pulling you forward. Looking back, that first win was never about the speech itself. It was about identity. It was about realizing that I didn't have to accept the identity handed to me by circumstance. I could choose my own. I could carve it, word by word, action by action, until it became undeniable. And when you've had that kind of moment, it's impossible to go back to living small. Once you've tasted what it feels like to surprise yourself, to surpass yourself, you can't unlearn it. You walk differently. You dream differently. You fight differently, because deep down you know. You've already proven what's possible. So the boy who came from nothing, the boy who wasn't supposed to stand out, suddenly had a reason to stand taller. That win became a compass. It pointed me in a direction that was bigger than my street, bigger than my city, bigger than the story I was born into. And even though I had no map, I had something even more important: belief. Belief that my words mattered. Belief that my story mattered. Belief that if I could rise once, I could rise again and again and again. And that belief, that was the beginning of everything. I still remember the smell of the airport. That strange mix of coffee, perfume, and something metallic in the air. It was my very first time standing in a space like that, surrounded by people dragging suitcases with wheels, moving quickly as if they had important places to be. I stood there, wide-eyed, clutching a small bag that carried more hope than clothes. For a boy who had never even dreamt of leaving his neighborhood, this was not just a journey. This was an awakening. The first flight. You can't explain to someone who has flown 100 times what it feels like to fly for the very first time. The boarding pass in your hand feels like a passport to another life. As I walked through that tunnel, I couldn't help but think, this is what the world looks like when it opens up. I sat by the window, because of course you sit by the window when it's your first flight. I pressed my face against the glass as the engines roared, and when the wheels finally lifted off the ground, it felt as though I was leaving more than just a runway. I was leaving behind every limitation that had ever been placed on me. You see, up until that moment, the world had been a very small place. My world was my street, my school, my community. That was it. And in that small world, the conversations were about survival, about making ends meet, about who didn't have what, about how little there was to go around. But here I was, rising above the clouds, watching the earth shrink beneath me, realizing that life was so much bigger than the block I grew up on. When we landed, the air felt different, colder, sharper. I remember touching foreign currency for the first time, the crispness of the notes, the coins that felt unfamiliar in my hand. It's strange how something as simple as money, just paper and metal, can remind you so powerfully that you're far from home. I was in a place where the language sounded different, where the cars drove differently, where the buildings seemed older and taller. Everything around me whispered, "You don't belong here." But at the same time, something inside me shouted back, "You do now." That first exposure to a new world was overwhelming. The scale of it, the rhythm of it, the speed of it. It forced me to rethink everything I thought I knew. I realized how much of life is invisible until you step outside of what you know. At home, success had a certain definition, a steady job, a small house, enough to feed your family. But here, success looked different. It looked global. It looked like people moving with certainty, chasing opportunities that stretched beyond borders. And it made me wonder, why not me? Why should this kind of life be reserved for people who happened to be born here? Why couldn't a boy from Benoni claim a seat at this table too? That trip wasn't just about geography. It was about perspective. When you come from a place where resources are scarce, you're trained to think small, to shrink your dreams until they fit inside the box that circumstances give you. But standing in this new world, I realized that the box was imaginary, that the limits I had accepted as real were nothing more than stories I had been told. Stories that fall apart the moment you step onto a plane and land in a place where possibilities feel endless. I came back from that journey with new eyes. The streets of my hometown looked smaller. The excuses sounded weaker. The doubts felt lighter. I had seen too much to believe in the lie of limitation anymore. I had learned that the only real difference between me and those people in the foreign airport lounges was access to opportunity, access to networks, access to belief. And access can be earned, created, forced open if necessary. The most powerful part of that first exposure was not what I saw out there. It was what I discovered inside myself: courage, hunger, a refusal to settle. I knew I could no longer live as if the world was small, because I had tasted how big it really was. That experience planted a seed in me that would grow into an unshakable drive to build, to expand, to claim my place not just in my neighborhood, not just in my country, but on the global stage. And here's the truth: when you travel for the first time, when you leave the comfort of the familiar and step into the unknown, you don't just cross time zones, you cross versions of yourself. You leave behind the version that only knew survival, and you step into the version that dares to thrive. That flight wasn't just about going somewhere new. It was about becoming someone new. So when I look back at that moment, I don't just see a young boy on his first plane ride. I see the birth of a mindset, the birth of ambition without borders, the beginning of a journey that would demand everything of me, but also give me more than I could have imagined. That first international exposure didn't just change my world. It changed the way I saw the world. And once your vision expands, you can never go back to seeing small again. 19 years old. At that age, most people are still trying to figure out who they are. They're caught between the confusion of youth and the responsibilities of adulthood. I was no different. Young, inexperienced, unsure of my place in the world. Yet somehow, I found myself standing in a room where I had no business being, facing an audience I had no right to address. The Black Management Forum. Leaders, executives, thinkers, decision makers. And there I was, barely a man, being handed the microphone. It's strange how moments arrive before you think you're ready. I remember the night before, lying awake, rehearsing lines in my head, asking myself what I could possibly say that would matter to people with titles and authority. People who carried themselves with the confidence of those who had already achieved. I was just a boy from Benoni. What did I have to offer? But deep down I also knew this. Opportunities don't ask for your permission. They don't wait until you're ready. They arrive. And when they do, you either step forward or step aside. Walking into that hall, the air felt heavy. It wasn't just a conference. It was history. These were the rooms where ideas collided, where strategies were shaped, where futures were decided. And now it was my turn to speak. I could feel the eyes on me before I even opened my mouth. Some were curious and some scared. Others, I could tell, were wondering why a teenager would be on this platform. When I started speaking, my voice was shaking. But then something happened. I locked eyes with someone in the front row, and suddenly, I wasn't a boy anymore. I wasn't speaking as a 19-year-old. I was speaking as a messenger. I spoke about vision, about resilience, about the hunger to rise above circumstance. And slowly, I watched the room shift. Arms folded at the start now rested open. Heads nodded. People leaned forward. The energy in the room moved from doubt to belief. And then there was him, the President of the Republic, sitting quietly in the audience. His presence was like a shadow over my words, reminding me that this moment carried weight. But instead of shrinking, I grew. The more I spoke, the more my voice filled the room, and the more I believed that maybe, just maybe, I belonged here after all. What that moment taught me was this: greatness does not wait for age. It doesn't ask how many years you've lived. It doesn't care about your CV or your bank balance. Greatness only asks one question. When the mic is in your hand, what will you do with it? That day, at 19, I realized that if you can bring truth, clarity, and conviction, the world will listen, no matter how young you are. I left that stage a different person. Before, I was just someone who had discovered a talent. After, I was someone who had discovered a purpose. There's a difference between a gift and a calling. A gift is what you can do well. A calling is what you were put on this earth to do. That speech transformed my gift into my calling. What I didn't realize then, but understand now, is that rooms like that don't just test you, they shape you. They test your courage, your preparation, your belief in yourself. But they also plant seeds. Seeds of possibility. Seeds of responsibility. Because once you've spoken in front of leaders, once you've seen them take your words seriously, you can never again tell yourself that you're too small or too young to matter. That invitation at 19 was not just a chance to speak. It was a mirror, reflecting back to me who I could become if I kept pushing, kept growing, kept daring to step into spaces that intimidated me. It was a reminder that leadership is not about age, it's about influence. And influence is not about titles, it's about impact. After that event, doors started to open. People began to see me not as a boy with a hobby, but as a voice worth listening to. But here's the truth. The most important door that opened was inside me. A door to a new identity, to a new possibility. That moment forced me to decide, was I going to play small, or was I going to rise to the expectations that were now being placed on my shoulders? I chose to rise. Because once you've been given a platform, you carry a responsibility to be better, to work harder, to represent more than just yourself. At 19, I didn't just speak for me. I spoke for everyone who had been told they were too young, too inexperienced, too unqualified. And the moment they applauded, I knew I had proved them wrong. Looking back, that speech was a turning point. It wasn't perfect, I wasn't polished, but I was real. And sometimes, authenticity carries more weight than perfection ever could. What I learned that day is that if you bring yourself fully to the moment, raw, unfiltered, unapologetic, the world will respect you, even if it doesn't fully understand you yet. So yes, 19 is young. Too young for some rooms, too young for some stages. But that day taught me this: you're never too young to lead, you're never too young to inspire, you're never too young to begin. All it takes is one invitation, one microphone, one room full of people willing to listen. And if you're brave enough to seize that moment, it can change the trajectory of your entire life. There comes a point in your journey where the rooms you once dreamed of standing in become too small for the voice you've grown into. That's when the world begins to call. It doesn't call politely. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. It pulls you, drags you, demands that you stretch beyond the borders of your comfort. That was the moment when the stages stopped being local and started becoming global. When audiences were no longer just familiar faces from my community, but people in cities I couldn't even pronounce, cultures I had never encountered, and boardrooms where every eye demanded proof that I belonged. Stepping onto international stages is not glamorous at first. It's terrifying. Imagine standing in a room where no one shares your history, your accent, or your struggles. You're stripped of every excuse. All you have is your story and your ability to deliver it in a way that resonates beyond borders. That's what being a global keynote speaker taught me. That truth is universal. You can walk into a hall in Singapore, in New York, in Lagos, and if you speak with clarity, courage, and conviction, people will listen. Because beneath the different languages and customs, human beings everywhere crave the same thing: to be reminded of what's possible. But speaking globally also forces you to grow. You can't recycle the same stories forever. You can't lean on your background as a crutch. People on the world stage can smell mediocrity. They expect you to bring something fresh, sharp, and powerful every single time. So I learned to build discipline around my craft, reading voraciously, studying different markets, understanding cultures, and constantly sharpening my ability to connect. Because the moment you stop growing, the moment you believe your last speech is good enough, that's the moment you start dying as a speaker. Traveling the world and speaking on some of the biggest stages was an honor, yes, but it was also a responsibility. Every time I walked onto a stage, I knew I carried more than just my own name. I carried the name of my country, the weight of my continent, and the hopes of countless young people watching from afar, wondering if someone like them could one day stand where I stood. That responsibility shaped me. It pushed me to show up differently, not just to inspire, but to challenge, to provoke thought, to leave people unsettled enough to act, because a speech without impact is nothing more than noise. But something else was happening alongside the speeches. While the applause and standing ovations were meaningful, I began to ask myself, what happens after the clapping stops? Words can ignite, but what sustains change is action. That's when the entrepreneur in me began to rise. I realized I could not only speak about transformation, I had to create it. Business was never just about making money for me. It was about building systems that outlast speeches. It was about creating opportunities for others, funding dreams that would otherwise remain buried, and showing that ambition from the township could compete with ambition from Wall Street. Being on the global stage gave me visibility, but building businesses gave me credibility. It's one thing to speak about leadership. It's another thing to meet payroll for hundreds of families. It's one thing to preach about risk-taking. It's another thing to put your own capital on the line, knowing that failure is not just personal but public. The transition into entrepreneurship wasn't easy. It never is. The same people who applaud you on stage will doubt you in the boardroom. The same audiences that cheer your vision will question your execution. And in those moments, you realize that speaking and building are two different games. One requires words, the other requires grit. And yet, they feed each other. Speaking taught me how to sell vision. Business taught me how to turn vision into reality. As an entrepreneur, you learn quickly that resilience is your greatest currency. Deals fall through, partners betray, markets crash, but you keep going because the mission is bigger than the obstacle. And when you build globally, you discover that the world does not owe you anything. No one is going to hand you a seat at the table. You have to bring your own chair, sometimes even build your own table. That's what entrepreneurship taught me. That ownership is not given, it is taken. Over time, I found myself living in two worlds, the world of the global keynote speaker and the world of the serial entrepreneur. At first, they felt separate, but eventually I realized they were two sides of the same coin. The stages gave me influence, the businesses gave me impact. The speeches lit the fire, the companies kept it burning. Together they formed a cycle: speak to inspire action, build to sustain it, return to the stage to share the lessons, then build again. Looking back, it's clear that this was more than just a career evolution. It was an identity shift. I stopped being someone who was invited to speak. I became someone who had something to build, something to protect, something to fight for beyond applause. And when that happens, you stop chasing validation and start chasing legacy. That's the true power of becoming a global keynote and a serial entrepreneur. It's not the travel, not the titles, not even the money. It's the knowledge that you can plant seeds in the hearts of people with your words, and water those seeds with real opportunities through your ventures. It's the ability to stand on a stage in one country and know that your work in another country is silently echoing the very same message. That possibility is limitless. And once you've lived in that space, where influence meets impact, you can never again accept a life that is small. You are driven by a force larger than yourself, a calling louder than applause. And in that space, you no longer measure success by how many people clap when you finish speaking, but by how many lives are different long after you've left the stage. There comes a time when you realize that words, as powerful as they are, can only go so far. A speech can ignite a fire in people. It can wake them up, shake them, force them to see the world differently. But after the applause fades and the lights go out, the question remains: what happens next? I began to wrestle with that question when the stages became bigger, the audiences more diverse, and the expectations heavier. I realized that while words can spark change, only action can sustain it. That realization was the beginning of the shift. I had built a reputation as someone who could command a room, move hearts, and challenge minds. But I started asking myself whether I was changing words in a way that lasted beyond me. Inspiration is important. It's the first step. Inspiration without structure, without capital, without systems, dies. That's when I understood that if I wanted to truly transform not just individuals, but communities, economies, and futures, I had to step off the stage and into the arena where real battles are fought. The world of business, the world of investment, it wasn't an easy shift. On stage, the currency is applause. In business, the currency is risk, and risk is expensive. When you stand in front of thousands of people, you can speak with passion, and they will reward you with admiration. But when you sit across the table from investors, founders, or bankers, passion alone isn't enough. They want numbers. They want proof. They want a strategy that works when the emotions wear off. So I began to build. Not just businesses, but vehicles of transformation. I wanted to take the same energy I brought to the stage and channel it into enterprises that created jobs, that unlocked opportunities, that gave people access to tools they had been denied. Speaking had shown me the hunger that exists in young people, the hunger to rise, to build, to matter. Investment gave me a way to feed that hunger, to back it with resources, to turn raw ambition into sustainable reality. And let me be clear, stepping into the world of investment was humbling. The learning curve was steep. Deals collapsed. Partnerships went sour. I made mistakes, expensive ones. But that's the nature of building. You don't grow without scars, and every failure carried a lesson that no book or seminar could have given me. I learned how markets move, how people behave when money is on the line, how fragile trust can be, and how powerful it becomes when it is honored. Slowly, the shift began to take shape. I was no longer just the speaker telling people what was possible. I was becoming the investor making it possible. I was no longer the outsider inspiring from the sidelines. I was on the field in the game, creating platforms for others to stand on. That was the real evolution, from voice to vehicle, from inspiration to infrastructure. Being an investor isn't about chasing returns alone. For me, it became about being a custodian of possibility. Each investment was more than a transaction. It was a statement that said, I believe in you when others don't. A statement that said, your dream is worth risking capital for. And in that belief, I saw lives change. Founders who once doubted themselves suddenly built companies that employed dozens, even hundreds. Communities that once relied on aid began to thrive on enterprise. That is the kind of change no speech, no matter how brilliant, can ever achieve on its own. And as I built this identity as an investor, something else happened. My perspective widened. I began to see the gaps in our economies not just as challenges, but as opportunities. Lack of infrastructure meant opportunities to innovate. Lack of access to funding meant opportunities to build platforms for financing. Lack of mentorship meant opportunities to create ecosystems where knowledge could be shared. I stopped seeing problems as obstacles and started seeing them as frontiers waiting to be conquered. That is when the word changemaker started to mean something real to me. It's one thing to want change, it's another to fund it, build it, and fight for it. Being a changemaker is not glamorous. It means sleepless nights, hard decisions, sometimes even walking away from comfort to stand by your principles. But it also means impact. The kind of impact that reshapes not just individual lives, but generations. The shift also demanded that I carry myself differently. On stage, it was enough to speak powerfully. As an investor and changemaker, I had to live powerfully. Every decision mattered. Every move carried weight. I became more deliberate, more disciplined, more focused. Because once you move from words to action, people stop listening to what you say and start watching what you do. And here's the truth. This shift was never about leaving the stage behind. The stage will always be home, but now the words carry a different weight. When I speak about risk, I speak as someone who has lived it. When I speak about entrepreneurship, I speak as someone who has built, who has failed, who has won, and who has paid the price. When I speak about leadership, it's not theory, it's practice. And that is why the shift matters. Because now the applause is not just for what is said in a moment. It's for what is lived over a lifetime. Looking back, I realized that the journey from speaker to investor to changemaker was inevitable. It's the natural evolution of purpose. Words are the spark. Investment is the fuel. Change is the fire. And once you've tasted the power of building something that outlives applause, you can never again be satisfied with just giving speeches. You want to build legacies. You want to create futures. You want to leave behind not just echoes of your voice, but evidence of your work. And that is the true meaning of the shift. It's not about abandoning one path for another. It's about aligning your voice with your actions, your passion with your purpose, your influence with your impact. It's about stepping into a space where inspiration and execution meet, where talk and action are one. And in that space, you stop being just a speaker. You become a builder. You become an investor. You become a change maker. So if you ask me, what was the moment that changed me forever? It wasn't a victory. It was the belief that followed it. The belief that said, you are not defined by where you come from, but by what you do with where you're going. And from that moment, Benoni to boardrooms, fear to freedom, silence to speeches, that belief carried me forward. And now I ask you, what's your moment? And when it comes, lean in, because your life, like mine, will never be the same again.